Streaming Complexity and the Renaissance Mass Ordinary Cycle, a project by Finn Upham, currently working at Ritmo at the University of Oslo, and Julie Cumming from the Sherlock School of Music at McGill University. Vocal polyphony was central to church music through the European Renaissance, but studying the perceptual experience of this is complicated by the fact that we do not have access to the audiences of the day. So to look into perceptually relevant qualities of this genre, we undertook an interdisciplinary study that combined what we thought might be reliable sensory processes that could be inferred from surviving scores and information from contemporary accounts of church and music practices of the day. In this case, what we were working with were mass ordinary cycles, as this was the preeminent compositional form of the time, which emerged from changing worship practices within the church, and for which there are hundreds of examples still surviving. Our focus perceptually was specifically reliable qualities of auditory scene analysis, stream formation, as it interacted with polyphonic compositional techniques. And musicological and theological research also helped us reconstruct how parishioners participated in masses in the 15th and 16th centuries. Today, we often hear these works in pristine conditions, with a quiet concert audience or attentive parishioners following along with the printed program. Accounts of masses in the busy cathedrals of the 16th century explain that attendees' experiences were complicated by competing activities, such as low mass spoken in side chapels at the same time as sung mass in the main worship space. Churchgoers would have been familiar with a mixed soundscape that included polyphonic singing rather than focused on it, like so. Unless they understood Latin, had been taught the order of service, and were seated close enough for the words of prayers to be intelligible, attendees had little chance of following along. It was their duty at the time to be present, but not to understand what was being said in every moment. Over a long service, there would need to be guideposts for parishioners to keep track of where they were. The emergent 5 movements of the Mass Ordinary Cycle represent the sometimes loudest and most consistent elements of the sung Renaissance Mass. Movements of the Mass proper were sometimes polyphonic, but their texts changed with the calendar, while priests' prayers and recitations could be exceedingly hard to follow at a distance. In this complicated sequence, something was needed to help mark ceremonial time. So what qualities might they have used to recognize movements of the Mass Ordinary Cycle? Melodies varied, but text treatments and other features of texture might have been audible under these conditions. To capture the dynamic complexity of polyphonic textures, we evaluated streaming complexity by identifying cues of separation in the details of counterpoint, pulling out when voices entered, changed pitch, and rearticulated notes. If the same event co-occurred with a higher voice, this cue supported merging. If it happened alone or in contrast, it would help distinguish the line and add to the complexity of the auditory scene. In this case, the 2 upper voices are strongly distinguished in the first measures, and the entering lower voices in the middle interval give an impression of greater numbers, at least initially. While an expert might recognize the number of voices needed to create the vertical harmonies in the last few measures, a casual listener would hear the homorhythmic texture as a simpler combination of streams. The contributions of each line are then merged to capture a continuous description of approximate auditory streaming complexity. With the parameters given, we estimate this perceived complexity at the beginning and the end of this excerpt to be similar, despite a changing number of parts sounding. The time series of estimated streaming complexity for each movement create a signature over time. Here, for example, are two movements of the same mass and their respective distributions of streaming complexity values calculated. For the purpose of this project, we've summarized these continuous features by their average values per movement for the analysis in conjunction with other factors defining these masses, namely date of composition and movement. The corpus we explore with this feature is a set of more than 200 mass ordinary cycles, composed between 1450 and 1600. The symbolic music files are from the Open Josquin Research Project database and the RenComp 7 collection. While not large in comparison to corpuses for more research genres, this set is notable for Renaissance research. The corpus includes works by at least 15 composers, very unevenly represented, with 101 masses by Palestrina, 26 by De la Rue, 18 by Victoria, 12 strongly attributed to Josquin, etc. Data cleaning for file quality and some incomplete cycles resulted in only 1,042 movements in the corpus across these 216 cycles. Our first hypothesis to test was a simple check on this feature of polyphony to see if it captured information relevant to the compositional practices of the day. We tested whether auditory streaming complexity had increased over time. Having grouped the masses by their time of composition, to the quarter century, as this information is hard to pin down, we performed linear regression on their average streaming complexity values over 150 years. In this corpus, aggregating masses by many composers, we see a substantial increase in streaming complexity over time, with 55% of variance between cycles explained by this trendline. But as streaming complexity is strongly dependent on the number of parts in a work, we also wanted to test this regression by looking at only those movements with the same number of voices. Although the increase is not quite as steep, the four-part movements show a comparably significant trend, with 45% of their variance explained by era. Thus, our hypothesis that streaming complexity grew through this period is supported, a change expressed in both the number of parts and in shifting compositional practices. Secure that auditory streaming complexity could vary meaningfully in Renaissance polyphony, we considered the main question, whether the movements within a mass cycle differed significantly in their complexity. We calculated this by looking at the relative mean streaming complexity values, numbers normalized per cycle by subtracting their average. This lets us see which movements tended to be relatively high or relatively low, despite the overall increasing trend over time. The distribution of relative values shows substantial variation per movement, while suggesting a trend of a softened V-shape, descending slightly from the first movements to the middle sections and then rising for the Agnus Dei. A two-factor ANOVA on these relative streaming complexity averages, per composer and movement, found a significant effect of movement. Pairwise differences were significant except for between the Kyrie and Gloria and the Credo and Sanctus. The hierarchy in streaming complexity matches some expectations from studying individual cycles. The two lowest complexity movements have their own reasons for being so. To get through 163 words, Credo movements are often said syllabically, with a great deal of homorhythm supporting the pronouncement of this important creed. The Sanctus movements involves much less text, but it also features sections with reduced textures of 2 or 3 voices, particularly in the Benedictus. The most complex movement, the Agnus Dei, is also known to be the most celebratory, often with more parts and special effects, like canons and extended pitch ranges. This hierarchy in complexity for these movements may not be strict, but it appears to be robust. And yet, according to the ANOVA, there is still a significant interaction with known composer. Those composers sufficiently represented in this corpus for quantitative analysis mostly show cycles shaped like the average, the gentle slope down to the Credo, and a sharp tick upwards for the Agnus Dei. Only one differed dramatically. The masses confidently attributed to Josquin des Prés show a remarkable increase in complexity towards the Credo movement, followed by a drop to the Sanctus and rise again for the Agnus Dei. Not only could a hierarchy in relative streaming complexity be measured across the masses of this corpus, but several composers showed similar patterns in their own works, despite the overall trend towards increasing complexity over time. While these composers would not have been using these terms, or likely parallel concepts to describe their intentions, this consistency in the measured feature suggests it correlates with qualities they did deliberately control. The first couple movements in the Mass cycle might vary in being relatively high or low, but the last few movements, the Credo to the Agnus Dei, may have been consistent enough in texture to be heard as signposts in the Mass service, even for those who are half listening. Josquin des Prés' remarkable deviations from the norm with a highly complex credo movement is an invitation to look more closely at his counterpoint and that of composers he may have had contact with. The auditory streaming complexity estimate, despite its distance from validation against reported percepts, appears to capture information related to the aesthetics of Renaissance polyphony and to its liturgical use. And careful computational studies of early music can yield new musicological insights despite methodological limitations around access to contemporary music makers and listeners. Our thanks to the sponsors of this research via the Shimsa Project, our colleagues at McGill, where this work was performed, and to you for listening. We look forward to answering what questions we can here at Future Directions in Music Cognition. But we also would like to share that a longer analysis of polyphonic complexity in this corpus has been accepted to Empirical Musicology Review, including a great deal more detail on the calculations and results. Thank you again.